תשכח ירושלים, תשכח ימיני, תדבק לשוני, הולכי כי אם לא אזכרכי.
Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? That was Keep Alive singing their a cappella song, I See Fire. That's a song about Tisha B'Av. The 9th of Av. We'll be commemorating it this Sunday, saddest day on the Hebrew calendar. We recall the first two temples. They were both destroyed on the same day, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. Sunday is a day to cry out, a day to say, help us, God. How are you? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do some beautiful learning on Wednesday? Paula in Chicago, Yehudit in South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, John in Maine, Bill in Missouri, Michael in Scranton, Paul in the Great Northwest, Nancy in North Carolina, Paula with a broken heart emoji, appropriate, Gail in Virginia, Stephen in New Hampshire. Over there on the YouTube side, Lindsay with us, I believe, in Cincinnati. Welcome, everybody. It's funny, I just happened to be wearing this today, and I decided to leave it on for the show. It's funny to me because this is actually the newest design in our store. That's the AT Wisdom Candle, available at shop.accidentaltalmudist.org. I designed that. I also designed this hat for the first movie that I was ever professionally involved in. I was hired to write a script. The movie ended up not getting made. It was called Granite. It's a fun movie. But while we were, promoting it and trying to raise the money for it, I designed this hat. So this hat and this shirt, you can see the similarities, but designed 25 years apart. You can see that artists have themes in their life. And it shows here. Another thing I wanted to mention as we're preparing for Tisha B'Av this Sunday, because we have an audience here, I sometimes get advanced copies of books as review copies. This one is spectacular from Koren Publishers. This is the new Koren Tanakh. It features a translation of the Torah by Jonathan Sachs. And other books of the Bible by Rabbi Weinreb. And it's just, they did an amazing job. I just got it today. It's not like I've really looked at it carefully. But I looked a little bit at this week's Torah portion and the book of Samuel, which we're reading in our family, just because I'm familiar with that lately. And the translation is beautiful. But what I also like and wanted to mention is they have these amazing illustrations in the back. Where is it? Including the temple. Okay, so this is just so cool. This is the Mishkan, the tabernacle, as it was in the wilderness. Right? So you can see the encampment of the children of Israel. There is the Holy and the Holy of Holies in the middle, and the courtyard that also contains the altar and the smoke coming up from the offerings there. So that's during the 40 years of wandering in the desert. Once we entered the Promised Land, the tabernacle stood for another 400 years. It was in a few different locations. Here is an artist's rendering of what it might have looked like when it stood at Shiloh. Then Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem on a site chosen by his father, King David. And this is Solomon's temple with a nice diagram there. And then it was destroyed, tragically, on the 9th of Av. It was rebuilt. The second temple was smaller in some ways, less grand in some ways, fewer miracles. But eventually Herod came along and actually expanded the temple complex by quite a bit. And you can see the large area contained by the outer walls of Herod's temple. And it's one of those walls which is still standing, a portion of that wall, which we know as the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And here is a rendering of the temple in Ezekiel's vision. That's the temple that hasn't been built yet. And perhaps that is what the third temple will look like. So very nice illustrations. This book was actually made possible by a friend of mine, David Magerman. I didn't even know that until it arrived today. So a big yasher koach to him and to the editors at Koren. I think this is a beautiful addition to Jewish books in general. Okay. Let's get into today's page. We are holding on Sukkah Daf Zayin. So this is page 7 here in Tractate Sukkah, the 7th volume of the Talmud. We are generally studying the laws of Sukkot, the fall holiday. We're in chapter 1 of 5. Chapter 1 is all about the Sukkah itself and what are its requirements so that it is a fit Sukkah, a Sukkah in which you can fulfill the commandment to dwell in a Sukkah during the holiday of Sukkot. And we've been talking about various dimensions, its maximum height, minimum height. Now we've been talking about the walls, and we will continue that. The first discussion that opens the A side of page 7, I'm actually just going to summarize by reading the halachas, the two summaries of the law on this subject. And this has to do with a sukkah. We've seen that a sukkah, legally speaking, only needs to have 2 complete walls and a portion of a third wall, and that third wall just has to be about a handbreadth wide. Some say just slightly more than a handbreadth. And then the question comes up, how should that third wall be added, right? So if you have 2 walls of the sukkah, and then you're going to add just a little bit of that third wall, is it like that? Could you actually angle it like this so that that little portion is extending toward that other corner? Maybe you should put that little portion over here so that it kind of defines where that other corner is in a more, visual and pragmatic way. That's what the sages are discussing on the A side of page 7. And the halacha comes out like this. If the sukkah has 2 adjacent walls, the third wall may be even just somewhat more than a handbreadth. Right, so they're talking about an expansive handbreadth. So like this is what the normal handbreadth, and then an expansive handbreadth is like that. So it's a little bit more than a handbreadth. And one places it less than 3 handbreadths from one side of the walls. So in this way, they get a little bit more of a wall, is what they're saying. So it's going to be just 1 handbreadth, but instead of putting it right on that corner, better to put it here. And as long as the gap is less than 3 handbreadths, then it's considered as if it's joined to that second wall through the principle of lavud. One places it less than 3 handbreadths from one of the walls. In addition, he must position a pole at least 7 handbreadths removed from that adjacent wall and complete the form of a doorway by placing a crossbeam from the top of the wall that is slightly more than a handbreadth to the pole. The law is ruled in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, as apparently the later Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud, Rava and Rav Kahana, held in accordance with his opinion. The law was also ruled in accordance with the latter version of Rava's statement and the custom of Rav Kahana that the form of a doorway is also required. Apparently, that is a requirement by rabbinic law, as by Torah law, a wall measuring a handbreadth is sufficient. So what the rabbis added is you only need 3 walls, one of which only needs to be a handbreadth wide. But since we're trying to make a structure that we're dwelling in, even though the 3 walls suffices, it should also have the form of a doorway included in that structure. Regarding a sukkah that's constructed like an alleyway. So here the sages are talking about if the two walls, you only need two full walls and a bit of a third wall. Well, what if the two full walls are not adjacent, but rather are parallel like this, kind of like the shape of an alleyway? Can you make a sukkah with that? If a sukkah has two parallel walls, then in order to complete the sukkah, one establishes a wall measuring somewhat more than 4 handbreadths perpendicular to and less than 3 handbreadths from the edge of one of the standing walls. In addition, here too, one must erect the form of a doorway along the third wall, as Rava's ruling applies to this case as well. So again, you need that form of a doorway in order to make the sukkah fit. Now we go over to the B side of page 7. Rava said, if one placed roofing over an alleyway that has a side post, it is fit for use as a sukkah. So now we're talking about two walls that are parallel like this. But it's not that you made two standing walls for some reason to make the sukkah. Rather, now what you've got is two walls on either side of an alley. Now, where did this come up? This came up in Tractate Shabbos and again in Eruvin, but especially Shabbos, right at the beginning of Tractate Shabbos, when we were talking about, let's say that there's an alleyway like this, and there's a courtyard over here and a courtyard over here that has residents in it. They'd like to be able to carry objects on Shabbos from one courtyard to the other courtyard. Can they carry through this alleyway? According to Torah law, yes, because the alleyway, especially if it's a three-sided alleyway, right, is like a private domain. But the rabbis said that's too similar to a public domain. You're going to have to adjust this alleyway so that everyone understands that it's being used as a private domain. And you can do that with a side post here. Now that you've turned this alley into a place where you can carry on Shabbos, the question the sages are asking here in Tractate Sukkah is, can you put roofing over the alley and consider this thing to be a valid sukkah? That's a discussion that we're going in right now. And so the first requirement is that it has that side post, right? Particularly now we might have an alleyway, as we've seen before, right? We talked about this also. If you only have two walls, can you make this fit for carrying on Shabbos? The side posts will only work on one end. On the other end, you're going to have to make some kind of form of a doorway for this to work, as I recall. But that's not what's being discussed right now. Right now, we're talking about an alleyway that has a side post. So probably we're talking about a three-sided alley. And similarly, Rava said, if one placed roofing over upright boards surrounding wells. Now, this is also a subject in that we talked about in Shabbos. Here we have, let me draw that. Here we have a well. Okay, now this is especially important when we're talking about pilgrims walking up to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage festival like Passover, Shavuos, or Sukkot, right? So it can be a long walk. It might take them a few days to get there, especially if they're going for Shavuos. It could be very hot in the summer in the Holy Land. So as a matter of public policy, they had wells along the way so that people could get water for themselves and for their animals. Now, if they're there on Shabbos on the way and they're outside this well in a public thoroughfare, they can't take water out of the well up to the public place where that's beside the well, because that's like taking water from the private domain, because it is considered a private domain, inside the well and transferring water to the public domain, which is prohibited on Shabbos. But the sages instituted a very simple fix. You could put these little corner posts in 4 corners around the well, and now what you've done is create a private domain within these corner posts, and you can take water out of the well and drink it or give it to the animals inside this enclosure, even though it's not really enclosed, it's just 4 corner posts. So if you have this structure, now the sages are asking, well, what if you put roofing that extends across from these, using these 4 corner posts to hold up some beams, and put roofing over the whole area, even though there's no walls at all here, there's only corner posts. Could you actually use this as a sukkah on Shabbos during Sukkot? That's the question being asked. And similarly, Rava said, if one placed roofing over upright boards surrounding wells, it is fit for use as a sukkah. A well is usually at least 4 handbreadths wide and 10 handbreadths deep. Therefore, it is considered a private domain and is prohibited to draw water from it on Shabbos, as I just explained. In fact, this is what I just explained, so I'm going to go on. And the Gemara notes, and it is necessary for Rava to state the halacha, the law, in each of these 2 similar cases, taking an alleyway that's been corrected for carrying on Shabbos with that side post, putting roofing over it. Can it be used as a sukkah? Yes. And the well with the 4 corner posts around it, and put roofing over that, can it be used as a sukkah on Shabbos? Yes. So the Gemara is saying, and it was necessary for Rava to teach both of those cases, even though they're similar. For if he had only taught us the case that the sukkah is fit in an alley, in the example of the alleyway, one could say that it is due to the fact that there are 2 full-fledged walls, one on either side. However, in the case of upright boards surrounding the wells, where there are not 2 full-fledged walls and most of the area is breached, say no, it wouldn't be considered a sukkah. So that's why he had to teach us the case of the 4 corner boards as well. So then you might think, well, if that seems to be the tougher case to prove, then if he had taught us that you can put roofing over the well with the 4 corner posts around it, would he have needed to teach us the case of the alleyway? Maybe that would be included in his ruling, that you could put roofing over the well and its corner posts and consider that as sukkah. And if he had taught us only the case of the upright boards surrounding wells, one could say that it is due to the fact that in that case, it is in the category of a sukkah with 4 walls. They might be virtual walls defined by those 4 corner posts, but there still is implied 4 walls. And in the alley, there's only 2 walls, where it is not in the case. So therefore, it would not work in the case of the alley. And that's why he taught us the case of the alley as well. And if he had taught us only these 2 cases, to teach that a partition with regard to the laws of Shabbos is considered a partition with regard to the laws of Sukkah, one could say that it is due to the fact that one can derive a halacha from a stringency, meaning the laws of Shabbos, to a leniency, meaning the laws of Sukkot. However, to derive a law from a leniency to a stringency, maybe not. Right? So what he's saying here is the laws of Shabbos are generally more stringent, more strict than the laws about defining a sukkah. And something that counts as a partition for Shabbos, if it counts for Shabbos, which is more stringent, has many more laws, then certainly it should count for sukkahs. But can we derive from the laws of Sukkah a law that we can then use on Shabbos? Maybe not, since Sukkot is more its laws are more lenient than the laws of Shabbos. The Mishnah continues, and a sukkah whose sunlight, i.e., the sunlight that passes through the roofing, is greater than its shade, is unfit. So now we're back to Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1, and we're continuing our discussion of it. And now we're talking about the idea that in terms of the roofing, in Hebrew, the schach, right? Not an easy word to say, schach, schach. The schach has to allow less light to pass, it has to provide more shade than allowing light to pass through, right? It blocks the majority of the light that wants to pass through it. Some light must pass through it, but it blocks more than it allows to pass through in order to be a fit sukkah. And the sages taught in a baraisa that in this statement, whose sunlight is greater than its shade, the reference is to sunlight that passes through due to the holes in the roofing, and not to the sunlight entering due to gaps in the walls, right? So especially if you have a tall sukkah, and you have big openings in the walls, so a lot of light could come through into the sukkah through the walls, especially when we're talking about early morning or late afternoon when the sun is lower in the sky, and a lot more could pass through the walls maybe than could come through the roofing. So if the walls are very sparse and a lot of sunlight is coming through more than shade, even though the roof is made properly that it has more shade than light, if the walls allow a lot of light to pass through, in fact, we're talking about you only need 2 walls and a little bit of a third, so it's almost as if 2 walls are missing. A lot of light could come in through those missing walls. So would that sukkah be fit or not? And the answer is, what only matters is the roofing. What really defines a sukkah, you need minimum walls, etc., you need minimum measurements, but the real characteristic of a sukkah that makes it a sukkah is the schach. It is the roofing. And it's about the roofing that it has to have more shade than light. And if a lot of light comes in through the walls, it doesn't matter. Rabbi Yoshia says, am I pronouncing his name right? Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia says, if the sunlight exceeds the shade of the sukkah, it is unfit, even if the sunlight is due to gaps in the walls. He lost that argument. The halacha, the law, follows the majority who say only what matters is that the roofing is made properly. If a lot of light comes in through the gaps in the walls, it's okay. Rav Yemar bar Shalemya said in the name of Abaye, what is the rationale for the statement of Rabbi Yoshia? It is as it was written in Exodus 40, verse 3, and you shall screen vesakota, the ark with the curtain. So referring to the Ark of the Covenant, which is in the Holy of Holies, and between the Holy of Holies and the sanctuary, both in the tabernacle and later in the temple, there is the paroches, the partitioning curtain, right? And so this is the same word in Hebrew, vesachta, as schach. It's the same root, right? And so this idea of screening, that the schach, which screens out light when it's acting as the roof of a sukkah, same word as the curtain, which screens the Ark of the Covenant inside the Holy of Holies from people seeing it, the priests seeing it from the sanctuary. So only priests can enter there. So if that same word seems to mean screen, that's why Rabbi Yoshia says, well, then it should apply to the walls as well, that they should only allow, more shade than light. And the curtain is a partition and not a covering over the ark. And nevertheless, the merciful one calls it roofing, sachacha. Apparently, we require the purpose of a partition to be similar to the purpose of roofing. And just as the roofing must be mostly impermeable by sunlight, so must the partition. That's Rabbi Yoshia's opinion. And how do the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yoshia interpret the term, and you shall screen vesakota? That term teaches that we should bend the top of the curtain a little bit so that it appears as roofing over the ark. It's as if that curtain really needs to seal the Holy of Holies and bend over a little bit to really join the ceiling. Abaye said, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Gamliel and Beis Shammai, the followers of Shammai, and Rabbi Eliezer and Acherim all hold that we require the sukkah to be sturdy and fit for dwelling like a permanent residence, right? So now that Rabbi Yoshia has said that the walls of the sukkah have to be mostly impermeable to light, that's going to trigger this little digression, or kind of just going off a little bit different direction. The Gemara is going to say that all these different rabbis have issued rulings which tend to make the sukkah more sturdy, more of a permanent residence. It is not a permanent residence, right? We only dwell in it during sukkahs, and we learn elsewhere that a sukkah has to stand up to a strong wind, but stand up to an average wind, but collapse in a very strong wind. It can't be totally permanent. It needs to remind us that when we were the children of Israel living, from the hand of God, eating manna and shielded by the clouds of glory from the sun, etc., that we were in God's hands, right? He was taking care of us. And truthfully, that's the way we always live, even though we think that our houses and our lives and our careers and our situation is solid. We've all heard enough stories to know that everything can get ripped away from you in an instant. We should be thankful every day for everything that we have that seems permanent. But especially during Sukkahs, we dwelling in the Sukkah, which reminds us that everything here is impermanent, right? So, nevertheless, now there's going to be a list of rulings from these various sages that tend to require the sukkah to be a little bit more sturdy, a little bit more permanent. And they explain. Abaye cites the relevant statements of these Tanaim, these rabbis of the Mishnah listed above. Abaye says, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi states this opinion, as it is taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, any sukkah that does not have an area of 4 cubits by 4 cubits is not fit. These are the dimensions of a permanent residence. We learned that a few days ago, that just as a house, to be considered a house, has to be a minimum of 4 cubits by 4 cubits. If it's smaller than that, it's not considered a house, and it doesn't qualify. It isn't restricted by all the laws which mandate the way you behave toward a house, as opposed to this thing, which is like, some kind of like, smaller than a house shed, some other structure, but it's not considered a house. And so Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, and like a house, a sukkah has to be at least 4 cubits by 4 cubits. We saw that the law is not according to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. The minimum measure of a sukkah, I think we ended up at 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths. Maybe it was even smaller than that. Right, because remember, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were arguing about how big does the sukkah have to be, and Beis Hillel said just enough to get your body and your head into it. And that was enough, at least according to Beis Hillel. But Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wanted to be bigger. 4 cubits by 4 cubits is like 6 feet by 6 feet. And that seems to make it, and to be that size, even though it's small, it's still going to be more permanent than one that is even smaller than that. And the fact that Rabbi Yoshia, who we've just been talking about, holds that a sukkah must be a permanent residence can be seen from that which we stated, that the walls must also be impermeable by sunlight like the walls of a permanent residence. Rabbi Yehuda also seems to hold that a sukkah must be permanent, have the characteristics of a permanent residence. As we learned in the Mishna, a sukkah that is more than 20 cubits high is not fit, but Rabbi Yehuda deems it fit. And a structure that is more than 20 cubits high, well, that's going to require some engineering and some additional support. And it can be and must be have a more permanent nature than a structure which is going to be lower than 20 cubits high. Rabbi Shimon agrees. As it is taught in a Baraisa, the dimensions of a sukkah are 2 walls in the standard sense and a 3rd wall that measures even 1 handbreadth. But Rabbi Shimon says 3 of the walls must be walls in the standard sense, and a 4th wall need only be a handbreadth. So apparently, sukkah must be surrounded on 4 sides, according to Rabbi Shimon, and that is more like a permanent residence. Rabban Gamliel holds that a sukkah must be a permanent residence, as it is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of one who establishes his sukkah on top of a wagon or on top of a boat. Rabban Gamliel says, not fit. A mobile structure is not a permanent residence. Rabbi Akiva deems it fit. Apparently, Rabban Gamliel requires that a sukkah have more of this permanent nature. I'm actually almost done, so if you've got questions or comments, please get them in. More sages who require that the sukkah have this permanent characteristic, more permanence as a characteristic. Beis Shammai seem to hold this way also, as we learned in a Mishnah, in the case of one whose head and most of his body were in the sukkah, and his table was in the house, not in the sukkah, Beis Shammai deemed the sukkah unfit, since a small sukkah is unfit for use, and one cannot fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah with it. And Beis Hillel deem it fit. So apparently, Beis Shammai required that the sukkah be similar to a permanent residence in the sense that your table fits in it. Beis Hillel don't require that. Rabbi Eliezer holds that a sukkah must be a permanent residence, as we learned in a Mishnah, in the case of one who establishes his sukkah like a type of circular hut. Now we can think about a yurt, right? Whose walls slope down from the center and has no roof. This, in fact, is more like a teepee, right? Like a teepee that it doesn't really have a roof. It just kind of joins in the middle, a circular structure that joins in the middle at the top with no roof. That sounds a lot like a teepee. Is that a sukkah? Rabbi Eliezer, or one who rested the sukkah against the wall, taking long branches that would be like the roofing material of a sukkah, but instead of placing them on top of, that the beams or something that are across the top of the sukkah, he just leans them against a wall, like a lean-to, right? Like a lean-to. It doesn't really have a roof. It's just one of the walls slopes in to the other wall. Is that a valid sukkah? So Rabbi Eliezer says in the type of a circular hut whose walls slope down from the center and that has no roof, or the one who rests the branches against a wall, again a structure that has no real roof, Rabbi Eliezer says not fit because it does not have a roof, a proper roof, and the rabbis deem it fit. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, this, it has to be more like a permanent residence because permanent residences have roofs. Acherim agree. So acherim means others. Usually this actually refers to Rabbi Meir, right? Rabbi Meir, who got into hot water with the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and some of his rulings were taken away from being in his name and just attributed to others, say. So acherim agree, as it is taught in a baraisa that acherim say, a sukkah built in a circular shape like a dovecote is unfit because it does not have corners, and a permanent residence is one with corners, right? So the sages did not know about people living in yurts. They did not know from yurts. So even though it has a roof, it's circular. So acherim said no good because people don't really live in houses. At least Rabbi Meir didn't know if people who live in a permanent residence that's circular. But the rabbis deem it fit, right? So Rabbi Meir lost that battle. And halacha, a circular sukkah, a round sukkah is fit in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. With regard to the required minimum size of a round sukkah, since the minimum size of a fit sukkah is a bit more than 7 by 7 handbreadths. Okay, so that's the minimum size of a sukkah, 7 by 7 handbreadths. So the circumference of a round sukkah must measure approximately 30 handbreadths. Where do you get that? Right? Because in accordance with the conclusion of the Gemara. So tomorrow they're going to be talking a little bit about, well, does the square of 7, a square sukkah that's 7 by 7 handbreadths, does it need to fit inside the circle? Or does the circle need to fit inside of it? And it seems like where it's going to come out is that it's a circle that has a diameter of approximately 7. No, right? It's going to be that the square fits inside the circle because otherwise the circumference would be about 21, more or less, right? Pi, 3 and a little bit more, times the circumference, the diameter. But instead, they're going to say it has to have a circumference of 30. So basically, it's that 7 by 7 sukkah is going to need to fit inside that circular sukkah in order for it to have the minimum size. Bottom line, a circular sukkah is okay. All right. Let's go to your questions and comments. Sharon, are we doing a daf on Saturday night? I am chanting 2 chapters of Eicha, Lamentations in Shul, so that is why I was asking. I don't think we can have class because I have to attend the Eicha reading. Yeah, good point, Sharon. I think you're right. Let me just make sure that that's the way we're going to do it, but I think you're absolutely right. So what we'll probably do, okay, so first of all, there's going to be our annual reading of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, so on Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific. I'm sorry, at noon Pacific. On Sunday, we're going to be doing our reading. Nina and I will read the Book of Lamentations in English. And then we'll probably do a double daf on Sunday. But we'll be in the midst of a long fast. So let me just confirm that that's what we're going to do. But probable no class Saturday night and double daf Sunday evening at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Lucy, if you make an alleyway into a sukkah, then can neighbors share that sukkah and have one for both? Why not? There's no requirement that you dwell in your own sukkah, right? Not everybody can have their own sukkah, and sometimes people take meals in a shared sukkah. Restaurants and synagogues often put up a sukkah so that you can have meals in their sukkah. It's great if you can sleep in the sukkah every night. A lot of people rarely do that. But they do try to take all their meals in the sukkah during sukkah. So, I don't think there's a problem with having a shared sukkah. Not everybody has the opportunity to build a sukkah, but, hopefully everyone will have an opportunity to take their meals in one. Maxwell Horowitz, why is this holiday called Sukkot? What is the significance for Israel of the plural Hebrew word of sukkah? Does it mean sukkahs for each individual of Israel? So it's called sukkahs because when the law is explained in the Torah, it says, you shall dwell in sukkahs, to remind you that you dwelled in sukkahs when you were, wandering in the desert, when I took you out of Egypt. So exactly, it's the commandment is given plurally because it's given to the entire people. But certainly one person doesn't have to dwell in multiple sukkahs during sukkahs. It's more that the whole nation should have, sukkahs for them to use, and that's why it needs to be plural. And Maxwell also says there are also references in Torah against buildings too high, the Tower of Babel, for instance, and other examples in the Nevi'im. So you're talking about this idea. Why did the sages require that it be a 20 cubit maximum of the sukkah? The roofing can't be more than 20 cubits above the ground. In that case, it's because it's the roofing that is the definitive article of the sukkah, that roofing that allows some light in but more shade than light. And if it's too high up, like you kind of lose touch with the roof. You're not aware that you're dwelling in a sukkah. It could just seem like you're dwelling in some kind of other structure. So you want to be aware of the ceiling. In terms of don't build buildings that are too high. There was this idea of the arrogance of the people when they were building the Tower of Babel. But it wasn't just that they were building a tall building. It's that they intended to sort of build a stairway to heaven, as it were, right? They wanted to reach up into the heavens. They thought that if they went high enough, they could, enter the back door of heaven, as it were, and there was an arrogance to that. Not a few years ago, I heard amazing teaching from Rabbi Reuven Wolf here in L.A. I don't remember what his source was, but what was so interesting is that he read somewhere, I guess in Midrash, that the Tower of Babel was not intended to be a one-off stairway to heaven. What they were actually building was what's it called when you have a support system in a construction project, right? Forget the word. But the idea was that it was going to be a system of supports. There were going to be many towers of Babel, and they were going to, for what purpose? And then they were going to be all connected with like a lattice at the top. Why? Right? The Tower of Babel story comes after the flood story, the story of Noah and the ark. So what the people thought to do is to say, well, there was a flood once. We're going to make sure there's never going to be a flood again. And we're going to build this system of towers that are going to hold up the sky so that the heavens won't be allowed to open up and all that rain come down from above. And of course, same kind of arrogance. The reason there was a flood is because God decreed there would be a flood. If God decreed that there would be another flood, no system of towers is going to forestall that. And that was another reason why, God said these people are getting too big for their britches. We're going to scatter them, impose different languages on them, so that they won't, think that they can oppose heaven. They should be focused on living on earth. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night for page 8 at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night, and may these 9 days pass, the period of the 9 days before Tisha B'Av pass without, too much tsuris as we get ready for that. All the best.